In this podcast episode, we're going to discuss the historical background relating to the book of Mark. And we're going to discuss the author, who the author of this particular gospel is, or most likely is, who his recipients were, and why they needed a book such as this. And it's important to remember as we study not just this book, but any of the books in the Bible that these books are what's called occasional documents. And what I mean by that is that they're written for a specific occasion, and they're written with a specific audience in mind. And the book of Mark is no different. The author, Mark, wrote this book with a specific purpose for a specific people at a specific time. And he gave them the information that he gave them because he knew that it would be most comforting to them as they walk through the particular struggles and challenges of life that face them. And so this podcast episode, I think we should spend some time discussing just who those people were, just what their situation was like, and why they needed a book like the one they received, now called the Book of Mark. So that's where we're headed. Let's begin first, though, by discussing the authorship of the book. The book of Mark, like the other three Gospels, was anonymously written. And what that means is that nowhere internally is there a clear and direct statement of authorship. At no point in the book does the author come out and tell us exactly who he or she is. So the authorship is determined backwards, largely, and comes to us through church history. And at a very early point, possibly as early as 50 years after the writing of this book, the authorship was attributed to Mark. John Mark was his name, to be exact, and church tradition tells us that John Mark was a disciple of Peter, one of the apostles and disciples of Jesus. And as early as 140 AD, church leaders and historians began to attribute the book of Mark to this man, John Mark. A few references, historical references regarding this point. In 140 AD, Papias, the bishop of Hierapolis, which was a town in Asia Minor, said that Mark was Peter's interpreter and took the teachings of Peter to write this gospel. And this is something that church history would say fairly unanimously, that the author of this book, now called the Book of Mark, was probably John Mark, and that he was a disciple of Peter. This is the same Peter that we read about in the gospel accounts, the same Peter who was a close disciple of Jesus, who was with Jesus on the Mountain of Transfiguration, who was with Jesus after Jesus' resurrection on the beach as Jesus challenged Peter to become a church leader and asked him, "Peter, do you love me?" 3 times on the beach, and Peter responded, "Yes, Jesus, I love you." And Jesus called him to go and feed his sheep. This is the Peter I'm talking about. And church tradition tells us that this Mark, the writer of the Gospel of Mark, was his disciple. Again, in 185 AD, Irenaeus also says that this same Mark wrote this Gospel, and Irenaeus adds that he wrote it after Peter's death in Rome. Now, this leads us even farther along towards some of the specifics of the historical background relating to Mark's audience. But what we're beginning to see is that this book was probably written somewhere in the 60s, probably under the persecution beginning after the burning of Rome during the reign of Emperor Nero. And church tradition tells us that Peter was martyred during this time, probably under Nero's reign, somewhere between AD 64 and 68. Peter was martyred. We also have a pretty clear church tradition that Paul may have been martyred during this time as well. Those who think that Paul's Roman imprisonment, as recorded in Acts, ended with martyrdom, ended with death, would attribute Paul's death to the same time period. And so Irenaeus in 185 AD says that Mark writes this gospel from Peter's accounts of following Jesus after Peter's death in Rome, somewhere between 64 and 68 AD. Now that's going to be important for the authorship and the recipient of this book as we discuss further in this podcast episode, so keep that in the back of your mind. Continuing on, though, with early church tradition regarding Mark's authorship. Around 195 AD, Clement and Tertullian, two different church fathers, both state that Mark was the author of the book now attributed to him, and that he took his accounts from the teachings of Peter. So, pretty clearly, we have a fairly unanimous voice coming from church tradition telling us that Mark, this disciple of Peter, is the author of the book now attributed to him. And as early as the first century AD, probably as early as 130 or 140 AD, this book would have been referred to as the Book of Mark, just as it is today, and that comes to us pretty clearly from church tradition. So let's discuss together just for a second exactly who this person Mark was, because interestingly enough, we have some references to this guy in the rest of the New Testament, not in the Gospel of Mark itself, but in some of the other books of the New Testament. We get a little bit of a glimpse of who he was and what he was like, and so forth. So beginning in Acts chapter 12, we see this person John, whose other name is Mark, showing up. And interestingly enough, the story comes to us as Peter was arrested in Jerusalem during one of the festivals and imprisoned. And many of you know the story. As Peter is in prison, he is released miraculously through angels. The prison doors are open and Peter's let out. And when Peter realizes that this wasn't a dream, that he was released from prison, he goes directly to a house where some of the disciples and Christians were meeting. And this house that Peter goes to in Acts chapter 12, verse 12, is Mark's house. In fact, Acts 12:12 tells us that it was the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose name was Mark. So right away in Acts chapter 12, we see that this man Mark, that church tradition would tell us is the writer of the Gospel of Mark, was hooked up pretty closely with the early church in Jerusalem. That his mother, Mary, was probably a disciple or a Christian as well, was involved in this early Christian church in Jerusalem. And it looks like, at least, that a lot of the early church leaders were actually hanging out in Mark's house. So Mark probably grew up, although he wasn't one of the 12 disciples, although he probably didn't follow Jesus around directly during the 3 years of his ministry, although we may see an account of him being with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane in Mark 14. It appears that Mark at least was rubbing shoulders with a lot of these church leaders as they met in his house, at least in this one instance in Acts chapter 12. So that's pretty interesting. Again, in Acts chapter 12, verse 25, we see a mention of this same Mark. And it seems that this Mark was following Barnabas and Paul around on one of their early missionary journeys. Now, Acts 12:25 is before Paul and Barnabas' first missionary journey, which begins in Acts 13. But it's pretty clear from Acts 12:25 that John, whose name was Mark, returns to Jerusalem with Barnabas and Saul as they've traveled around doing some early evangelism. So right from the beginning, it appears that this man Mark was familiar with the early church movement, that he was involved with some of the leaders, that his mom was involved with some of the leaders, and that he himself was a traveling companion of Barnabas and Saul. And as you continue reading the Acts account, beginning in Acts chapter 13, Barnabas and Saul are commissioned, sent out on what the church would now call Paul's first missionary journey. And it appears that at least for part of that period, Mark was a traveling companion of Paul. In fact, towards the end of the first missionary journey, in Acts chapter 15, verse 36 through 40, Paul and Barnabas actually have a little scuffle as to whether or not Mark should accompany them as they continue on their journeys, because apparently during Paul's first missionary journey, Mark abandoned them in Pamphylia. And you can read about this discussion that Peter and Barnabas, that Paul and Barnabas have in Acts chapter 15, verse 36 through 40. So, pretty clearly, Mark is involved in early church history, that he was there even before Paul's first missionary journey as the church leaders met in his mother's house, and that he, in some way, accompanied Paul on his early journeys, including his first missionary journey. And most likely, for at least part of the time, Mark was accompanying Paul on his third missionary journey. And we can sort of infer this from the letter that Paul writes to the Colossians. In Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, is with Paul. So as Paul writes this letter to the Colossians, he states in his conclusion that Mark is with him in Colossians 4:10. And that's pretty interesting, because most likely Paul is writing the book of Colossians from Roman imprisonment. This is probably around the time that church history would say Paul may have been killed by Nero in the mid to early 60s. And here Paul's writing from Roman imprisonment at probably the end of his third missionary journey, and saying that Mark was with him. So we have a pretty clear testimony internally as we read throughout the Acts account and also through some of Paul's epistles that Mark was a pretty close companion of Paul, that he was in some sense traveling around with Paul and Peter, these major church leaders in the first century, as they did their ministry. So I think that makes Mark a pretty good candidate to compile a gospel, a story of Jesus' life. Although he may not have been one of Jesus' 12 disciples, he certainly would have heard plenty of stories about Jesus' life as he traveled with Peter, and he would have understood what church history, what the church at large would claim Jesus to be as he traveled with Paul. I think it makes him an awesome candidate to write one of the Gospels. And one more reference that's particularly telling, that comes to us straight from Peter himself, comes from 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13. So this is a letter that Peter wrote to the exiles of the dispersion, probably to Jews all over the Roman Empire. And Peter most likely wrote this letter from Rome. So as I mentioned earlier, Colossians places Mark in Rome, most likely with Paul, in the early 60s. And we also have a letter from Peter also placing Mark in Rome around this same time period. So 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13. In Peter's closing remarks of his letter, he writes this: "Your sister church in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends greetings, and so does my son Mark." Most likely when Peter says your sister church in Babylon, most people agree that Peter is referring to the church in Rome, using this Old Testament imagery, Babylon, to denote a pagan, godless place, not unlike the Babylon of the Old Testament. And Peter says that he's in Babylon, and that the church in Babylon, which I'm saying is probably Rome, sends greetings, as does Mark, his son. So here's Peter calling Mark his own son and saying that he's with him and with him in Rome. So if we're placing Mark in Rome, and if we're placing him there around the time of Peter's death, in the mid-60s, then we need to ask ourselves, what was going on in Rome around this time? And why is that important for our understanding of the book of Mark? And why was that important for the original reader? In other words, what was it about the circumstances of the original reader that necessitated a book such as the book of Mark? That's where I want to go now for the remainder of this podcast episode. And what we're going to see, hopefully, is that there was incredible persecution breaking out all over the Roman Empire, beginning in Rome and spreading all over the Roman Empire around the writing of the book of Mark, around the mid-60s, right around the death of Peter and Paul, that these two evangelists were swept up in this persecution and most likely killed as a result of it. And that it was this hardship, it was this struggle, it was this persecution coming down upon the Christians in the Roman Empire in the mid-60s that made the writing of the Gospel of Mark so crucial to the survival of the church and so crucial to the survival of the Christian witness in Rome. So let's talk about life in the Roman Empire in the early 60s. And really we need to begin with discussing who the Roman emperor was. And if you think about what we discussed the first hour, I mentioned that what we're seeing in Jesus is in such contrast to what the original reader would have seen in the Roman emperors. The way we see Jesus lead the church as suffering servant, the way we see him interact with people, although he is king of the universe, he lays aside his right to authority and domination, and he humbly serves. The way we see Jesus serving and suffering is so different from what we see in the earthly leaders, and it would have been so different from what the original reader would have seen in their emperor at the time, Emperor Nero. So let's place ourselves in Rome in the early 60s, and let's imagine what it would have been like to live under the rule of Emperor Nero, discussing for a moment just exactly what he was like.
You know, the Roman Empire in the first century was a terribly cruel place. And oftentimes at the center of that cruelty were the emperors. The Roman historian Suetonius, who was born in AD 69, not long after Nero's death, gives us a really good glimpse into the lives of the emperors in the first century BC and AD. If you're curious in doing some extended reading, I would recommend Suetonius' work, The 12 Caesars. It's The 12 Caesars of Suetonius. In this book, he covers a history of the Caesars, beginning with Julius Caesar in the first century BC, 100 BC, and running all the way through the 12 following Caesars, right through the reign of Domitian, who ended his reign towards the close of the first century AD. So what we have in the 12 Caesars of Suetonius is a great history of the Caesars around the time of Christ, and you really get a great glimpse into what it was like to live in the Roman Empire around the time of Jesus and the first disciples and the writings of the New Testament through his book and his works. And I would recommend it because, boy, especially for the book of Mark, it's helpful to understand what the original reader were facing. And what you're going to see as you read this book, not just his history, but really any history of the Roman emperors in the first century, is that these guys were incredibly cruel and arrogant and domineering and authoritative and almost ridiculous, definitely ridiculous in my opinion, in the way they wielded their power and their authority. And they commanded an empire that was the strongest empire on earth, and it demonstrated unbelievable wealth and prosperity and glamour. And the Roman emperor stood in the midst of this glamour and showed it off and really portrayed themselves as powerful people who were to be desired by all who looked on, and flaunted their wealth and their power and their authority at great expense to those around them. And that's important as you think about the lives of the original readers who are looking at this type of stuff and then looking at the life and ministry of Jesus and the lives of his followers and seeing such a sharp contrast between the wealth and the respect, but the incredible cruelty of the emperor, and then at times the disrespect that comes along with following Christ. And they're asking themselves, man, which kingdom is more powerful? That's so important as we study the book of Mark, because we're going to see Mark just combating this notion that greatness looks like what they see in the lives of the Roman emperors. Mark just comes right against that and says, you know what, greatness in the kingdom of heaven is totally different than what you see in the lives of the emperors. It's to be least, not first. It's to be the servant, not the Lord of all. It's to give your lives for others. And what we have in the center of that image is Jesus Christ, who gave his life for us. What a beautiful picture of the heart of God in contrast to the heart of mankind. That's what we have in the book of Mark, but we need to understand it against the background of the Roman emperors. So let's get into it, and let's begin to talk about what it was like to live under the reign of this particular emperor, Emperor Nero. Because in a lot of ways, Nero's life really typifies what you're going to see in a lot of the Roman emperors. Some of the things that we see in his life are just even as terrible as they are not atypical for the rulers of the Roman Empire. So in 54 AD, Nero becomes emperor after his adoptive father, Claudius, was poisoned by his wife and Nero's mother, Agrippina. And so this is 54 AD, and Nero is about 17 years old when this takes place. He becomes emperor of the Roman Empire at 17 years old. And for the first 5 years, he rules side by side with his mother. And that co-regency comes to an end when Nero has his own mother killed because he wanted to rule the throne solely. So that just gives you a little bit of a glimpse into what kind of guy we're talking about here. Suetonius, again in his book, The 12 Caesars of Suetonius, goes on and describes some of the terrible things that Nero did. And among them, Suetonius describes that Nero would disguise himself, dress up in some disguise, and walk around the streets of Rome getting into all sorts of trouble. And one of the things he would do is stand out in front of the entrances to bars and wait for drunk guys to stagger out of these bars, and then Nero would walk down behind them down a dark alley, stab them to death, and toss their bodies in the gutters. This is the emperor of the Roman Empire that we're talking about, committing murder on his own streets. So we're talking about a guy who had a really warped sense of morality, or no morality at all. Suetonius continues to go on to describe some of the other terrible things that Nero did, including breaking into shops around the city of Rome, stealing the goods, and setting up those goods in his own sort of mock market in his palace, and auctioning off the shop owner's goods and then squandering the proceeds. Suetonius describes Nero as rarely traveling in a train of less than 1,000 chariots. And, just let me stop there for a second. If you're an original reader and you are looking at an emperor who travels in a train of 1,000 chariots when he announces his arrival, think about that in contrast to the way Jesus announced his arrival through the ministry of John the Baptist that we see right at the outset of Mark in chapter 1. And I think Mark's doing that on purpose, as we'll discuss in the next podcast episode. We are seeing something in the heart of God that is so different than the heart of the emperor. We're seeing the King of Kings and the Lord of the universe announcing his coming, not with great pomp and with great extravagance, but with service and humility. Oh, that is awesome. What an awesome contrast to what we see in the reign of this terrible, terrible emperor, Nero. So moving on with Nero, just to mention again, he would just flaunt his extravagance and the wealth of the empire in a variety of ways. And one of the things that Nero was really into was entertainment. And this doesn't distinguish him at all from the rest of the Roman emperors. Most of the emperors were incredibly involved with entertainment. And Nero would stage some extravagant entertainment. Chariot races, staged plays, gladiatorial shows, wars, mock battles, even mock naval battles on a huge lake that he had at his palace, a saltwater sea that he had constructed. Just unbelievable extravagance, and Nero just being at the center of it. And you've got to think about that as the original reader is seeing the type of extravagance that Nero is demonstrating and putting forth, and comparing that to what the kingdom of God looks like, especially as we're going to speak of in the next podcast episode. When you think about how Jesus describes the parables of the kingdom of God in chapter 4, when he says, look, the kingdom of God looks like this. It's like this little mustard seed. It's just this tiny little seed, but it grows and grows and grows into this huge tree. And you can imagine what kind of meaning that would have to an original reader who's looking at this persecuted kingdom of God, as we're going to describe in a second, as we describe the nature of the persecution and the reason for it. Who's looking at this persecution and this teeny tiny little seed of a kingdom of God amidst this seemingly huge and powerful and terrible kingdom of the Roman Empire, and just thinking to themselves, gosh, is this Jesus really for real? And is his kingdom really more powerful? And will it really outlast what we see in Nero? And Mark says yes, resoundingly yes, through his book to the original reader. But boy, they were struggling. Boy, they were doubting to believe that to be true as they look at Nero, his incredible cruelty, and also his seemingly endless power. Well, let's begin now for just a few minutes to discuss some of the pertinent historical background relating to this persecution that I've been sort of mentioning sideways over this podcast episode. As I have mentioned, the original reader is facing very real and current persecution that is forcing them to take a serious look at what they see in Jesus and the kingdom that he came to announce. And many of them are asking the questions, gosh, is this kingdom legitimate? Is it for real? And is it more powerful than what we see in the Roman Empire and in the Roman leaders, the emperors themselves? And the book of Mark is very much written into this historical situation. And I just want to describe it for a minute and begin to speak about what exactly it was historically that brought about this persecution. And it really begins with what many would call the Great Fire of Rome, which began sometime after midnight on the 19th of July, AD 64. And up until this point, Nero and his stance on Christians and Christianity was actually pretty favorable. In fact, some of this background is pertinent for the book of Romans. Emperor Claudius, Nero's predecessor, had actually dispelled the Jews, whom he recognized as a potential political threat, from Rome itself when he was emperor. And when Nero takes over, he actually allows the Jews back in and adopted somewhat of a favorable posture towards Jews and Christians, not necessarily distinguishing the two from each other initially. And this sort of favorable posture continued until AD 64, after the Great Fire of Rome. And without going into it in too much history, beginning in July AD 64, basically the majority of the city of Rome itself burned down. Over about a week-long period, out of the 14 districts within which the city was divided, only 4 were spared. And 3 of these districts were completely destroyed, and the other 7 sustained incredible damage. Most of the city of Rome was completely devastated by a huge fire that swept through the city beginning in July AD 64. And towards the end of this fire, people started looking around and pointing fingers. And there was a rumor that began to spread that Nero himself had started this fire, and that he'd started this fire because he didn't like the way the city was laid out. He didn't like his palace. Remember, we spoke about some of the extravagance of Nero's reign, and he wanted to build himself a bigger house. So he burned down the city, burning his palace down as well, so that he could build back Rome the way he wanted it to be built, in a much more extravagant manner. And this rumor began to spread. In fact, Suetonius goes on to describe the rumor as though Nero himself were singing as Rome were burning, as he were singing a song about another town that had been burned, a town of Troy, and actually singing this song about the destruction of Troy as the city of Rome were burning. And we don't know concretely if that's true or not, but we do know that the rumor was spread, and sometimes perception can be greater than reality, even if Nero himself did not start the fire. So Nero's got a problem as an emperor. He needs a scapegoat, and he needs somebody to blame this fire of Rome on. And Nero turns to the Christians. He turns to the Christian community and blames them for the fire of Rome. You got to ask yourselves, why would Nero turn to the Christians and blame them for the fire of Rome? And among other things, I think that it's important to understand that in the first century, the Christian church and the Christian community was very much an outcast. They were very much an outcast. They were living amongst a culture that was very ungodly and very pagan, and they stood in the midst of it, and they called it what it was. They called sin, sin. And they said to their culture, to the Romans around them, we will not go along with some of the things that your culture puts up with. And because of that, largely, the Christian community, as it grew in the early first century, was seen as a rebel group of people who were haters of the human race. I mean, they were disliked by everybody. The Christians were totally disliked by everyone in Rome because they refused to go along with so many of the social norms. They wouldn't worship in the pagan temples, which were so much a center of community life and business life. The Christians would refuse to worship in those locations. And they wouldn't join the mystery cults or the mystery religions. They wouldn't go and watch some of the spectacles that took place in the gladiatorial arenas. Just in so many ways. They wouldn't worship any of the deities that were spread all across the city. And they wouldn't go along with a lot of the magic practices that were so accepted in Roman culture. And just in so many ways, the Christians were seen as outcasts, and as such, they were seen as sort of judgmental. And in some ways, it's very similar to the way Christians are viewed today in some cultures, just seen as judgmental people who are constantly pointing the finger at the culture around them and turning their nose up at their neighbors. And I just think that because of that, they made a really easy scapegoat for Nero. If he needed someone to shift the blame from off of himself, it landed right on the Christian community. And that was a bad thing, because Nero instigated a very severe period of persecution. And as I mentioned earlier, church tradition would tell us that Peter and Paul were both martyred during this time period as a result of what history would now call the Neronian persecution of the church. Beginning in 64 AD, Nero, blaming the Christians for the fire in Rome, began to persecute the church in a very widespread manner, and lots of Christians died during this time. And this is the particular historical event that the readers of Mark find themselves facing. They are facing very real persecution. Tacitus, a contemporary historian at the time, tells us that Nero made the persecution and the martyrdom of Christians a public event and an occasion for popular entertainment. Tacitus states that Nero's gardens were often thrown open for these executions, and that Nero would actually soak Christians with wax and oil and burn them as fuel, as lights, as human lamps for his parties in his own gardens. Tacitus says that Nero had some Christians crucified and others sewn up in the skins of animals and hunted down by dogs. Just terrible things, terrible cruelty and suffering that Nero instigated on the Christian community in the years following the fire of Rome in 64 AD. And these are the types of atrocities that face the original reader in the book of Mark. And boy, they're asking themselves the question, is this the kingdom of God that is meant to be on earth? Is this the way that the kingdom of God really looks? If Jesus is so great, if his kingdom is so great, why do we find ourselves in the midst of such incredible hardship and suffering? And if he really is the King of Kings, if he really is the Lord of Lords, then why do we have this earthly king, Nero, killing us left and right? Is he more powerful than Jesus? They're just asking all these questions. Again, questions, good questions that you and I ask all the time. Questions like, why do I suffer? And in the midst of suffering, is God strong enough to stop it? And if he is strong enough to stop it, then why doesn't he? Why is it that God allows suffering in our lives? And doesn't he care about our suffering? And why doesn't everything that happens to me make sense to me? And where is God in the midst of this bewilderment? And what is his kingdom like? And what should I expect in the midst of it? And man, in many ways, the original reader is really struggling. They're confused. And they're struggling to understand the kingdom of God as they look at the kingdom of the Romans. And the book of Mark is such a gift to them. It's such an incredible gift to them, because in this book, Mark, he describes what the kingdom of God's like. I mean, not just in chapter 4 with the parable of the kingdoms, but through the story of Jesus' life, he describes what the kingdom of God is like. And he shows them that, the kingdom of God is so much better than anything that earth offers. Yet, it includes suffering. And that is an unbelievable paradox that the original reader is going to have to stomach. That it's so much better than anything Nero could offer. It's so much better than anything Rome with all of its extravagance and wealth could ever offer. But sometimes it includes suffering. And you know what? God is totally strong enough to stop any suffering. But yet sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he doesn't. And he totally cares about suffering. I think about the question that Mark shows the disciples asking Jesus in the boat as they're crossing the lake and they feel as though they're about to drown. They turn to Jesus as he's asleep in the boat and they say, "Jesus, don't you care that we're perishing?" Imagine the original reader hearing those words. They would say to themselves resoundingly, "Oh, that's my heart. Jesus, don't you care that we're perishing? We're dying at the hand of Nero left and right. Don't you care?" And look what Mark shows Jesus doing. Jesus totally calms the storm. He totally shuts down the waves. Of course he cares, but sometimes he chooses not to calm the storm. And why? The book of Mark just shows us that suffering is a normal part of Christianity, but that God is there in suffering, that he is totally present, that he doesn't always deliver us from suffering as we want him to. He doesn't always give us what we want, but he's given us what we need in his life, death, and his resurrection, and the salvation that he offers. He doesn't always give us exactly what we want, but he has given us exactly what we need. And so the original reader, as they suffer under Neronian persecution, would have just so eaten up these stories of Jesus and what his kingdom is like as they're given through Mark. And Mark highlights the suffering of Jesus to show the original reader very clearly that, look, it took his suffering to give us the incredible opportunity of salvation that we now have, and that his life demonstrates that suffering is a real part of the kingdom of God, that Jesus, not just Jesus will suffer, but that his followers will suffer too. And you know what? That was so difficult for the original hearer to understand. It was so difficult for the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes to understand as they looked at Jesus and tried to set aside their preconceived ideas of what the Messiah would be like. And it's the same for the original reader. It would be so difficult for them to understand the life and ministry of Jesus as they try and justify it against the cruelty that they face in life. And so, that really is the heart of the historical background. If I just had to summarize it, I would say, please, 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 as you study the book of Mark, you need to put on the shoes of the original reader. You need to become a Roman citizen in the first century who is suffering over the heavy hand of persecution coming down upon them by Nero. And you need to imagine the words that Mark gives us in that context, because they bring such incredible light as we see them in that way.